Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Well, Happy New Year's, listeners. We are kicking off 2014 with our three-part series, When Pets, People, and Places Collide, with guest experts Debra Hamilton and Gary Norman. Now, in this series, we will discuss applying traditional as well as virtual alternative dispute resolution tools and resolution of conflicts among people involving their animals. Yes, their animals. Now, we're not talking about mediating between pets, okay? But we are going to focus on everyday events that impact pet ownership, including divorce, neighbor, kennel, groomer, vet, or even dog park or dog walker issues. And we've all encountered those, especially if we're pet owners or even non-pet owners. Yeah, and of course, in particular, these conflicts involve service or assistive animals. That will be part of our series for the month of January, and we'll talk more about that. We're also going to explore how alternative dispute resolution methods, mediation, or collaborative practice help progress these difficult conversations towards resolution without litigation. Now, in this first episode, another arrow in your dispute resolution quiver, our guest will introduce listeners to the subfield within alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, so we'll use that as short, of animal-related conflicts. Our guest will tell you the what, the where, and how to include animal-related conflicts into your ADR practice and the tools available to ADR practitioners to assist those parties find their own solutions to such conflicts. Now, if you're a listener who's not an ADR practitioner, this is still very, very, very useful to you to understand if you find yourself in one of these situations, how can you reach out to resources such as ADR practitioners like Gary Norman and Debra Hamilton who deal with these specialized niche areas. Now, Debra, Voda Hamilton, but we'll say Debra Hamilton. She is actually a returning guest. She was on last year to talk about some of these issues, and she is the principal of Hamilton Law and Mediation. Debra provides an alternative means of resolving conflict and disagreements between breeders and owners and handlers, neighbors over barking dogs, divorcing couples, arranging pet custody agreements, yes, pet custody agreements, vets and their clients, condo co-op, tenant, and management. So there's a variety of areas where this is prime for collaborative or cooperative problem solving. Now, our mediation practice provides a neutral ground on which to have the conversation you want to have while peacefully coexisting. She helps her clients be heard at the time of the conflict and into the future. She works with everyone who wants to further their passion in the care of pets while reducing their exposure to conflict and litigation. Now, you can find her at Hamilton, Hamilton Law and Mediation, HamiltonLawandMediation.com. Our second guest is Gary Norman, who is an attorney. He's licensed in Ohio, Maryland, and before the United States Supreme Court. Now, he seeks to leverage ADR tools to resolve conflicts as well. And his many adventures about town, where he's often the sole or even the first guide dog team in the room, his able second guide dog pilot is usually present with them. And he has this uniqueness about joining the ADR field because he himself has a visual disability. Now, as a lawyer who specializes in the full range of ADR tools, including litigation when necessary, he believes that animals may play a leading role both at a mediation table and in the courtroom. When he's not doing all of the things he does, he may be found caring for his two dogs and a retired and an active guide dog, or reading one of his myriad of books from the Library for the Blind. Gary Norman's recent article, Dispute Thy Neighbor, Hire a Mediator, was recently published in the Virginia Maryland Dog Magazine. He can be found at gnorman, Norman, law.com, gnormanlaw.com, and we have that on the program pages in the chat room, which we have open, and we also have it in a number of places, actually. So tonight we do, again, have the chat room open. If you'd like to post there, simply go to blogtalkradio.com/Texas-conflict-coach. We also invite you to join our Twitter chat. We're using that right now, and that is #T, like Texas, CC Radio. And I want to say Happy New Year to both Gary and Debra, and welcome, Debra, back to the show, and welcome, Gary, for joining us for the first time.
Hello, Patty. This is Gary. I'm so delighted to be with all of you this evening.
Absolutely.
And I'm happy to be back, Patty. Thanks so much, and Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year indeed. This has been a long-awaited series that we've been wanting for a long time, and I'm glad, Debra, that a year ago you introduced yourself, and I'm like, what is animal pet mediation? What is this? So I was so excited when you introduced yourself, and we were able to introduce it to our listening audience, and then it was definitely worth warranting a whole series on that. And so we will have Debra and Gary back again on January 21st and 28th. Now, if you want to ask a question, we do have some folks in the chat room. We have some folks in our studio. You can call 347-324-3591. And if you want to ask a question or comment, please press number 1 key on your dial pad so that I know that you have a comment or question that you'd like to make. So let's get started. Let's just establish up front that conflict most certainly manifests itself between people and their animals, and we see and hear about such prolonged and unresolved conflict even in the news. And, Debra and I have talked about, the Dallas neighbor last year who shot and killed his neighbors over their dog's potty behavior. So most people don't even know about the resources available to them to resolve these common types of pet disputes. So in our communities, what is the proper venue for resolving disputes among neighbors or even friends about animals?
Well, at this juncture, I think the only place that people think they can resolve these disagreements is in court, or suffer in silence, or take matters into their own hands, as the people did in Texas.
And then
which is what we don't want to do.
Not at all. And then sometimes people may think that there's a certain form called a community mediation center, which sometimes is a very valuable tool, but often they don't have the specific training in animal-related mediation or animal-related conflict resolution that Debra and myself have.
And the emotion that comes into the room, because I did do community mediation at the beginning of my mediation career, it really, you have to have a full understanding of what the person is feeling, and sometimes it seems a little ridiculous, but in fact it's not. And as a mediator, you really have to respect everyone's place where you find them.
And then I also would add, there's a full range of avenues or venues where mediation is appropriate, specifically as we're talking about for animals. And it's more than just the courts. It's more than just a mediator's office. It can also be innovative ways, such as in regulatory public policy, where we're trying to bring the FDA together to work on animal welfare issues with the animal law section of the state bar, with individual handlers or even guide dog handlers like myself. And there's many other robust ways that we can bring people together to talk about their conflicts and get their minds together on the same page, if you will.
Right, because negotiation doesn't always work. People always think they can sit down and have a conversation about the animals in any venue, and often the mediator provides that one person in the room who gets you, and then conversations, as Gary just said, can progress in a way that you would never be able to do that necessarily without the mediator in the room.
All right, so before we get into some specific details, I'm sure our listeners are questioning or curious actually about how in the world does someone get interested in doing this kind of conflict work. You're both ADR practitioners, but you're also both lawyers. So what got you, in a brief way, what kind of got you passionate and started in dealing with this arena of conflict?
I think for me, Patty, I grew up in Northeast Ohio. I grew up with a very big-spirited mother of a Polish and Slovak tradition where food is so very vital to bringing people together, and we all gathered around for various holidays around our kitchen table in my house in Brunswick. And I also grew up in high school attending what's called the Civic Club of Cleveland, which uses very much the same model, but obviously in a professional context to bring people together to talk about public policy problems. As I attended law school, while I very much appreciated the litigation aspects I learned, I also very much appreciated my work in Cleveland Works to bring people together to get them transitioned from welfare to work, and using a full range of tools from litigation to public policy advocacy to kind of social work stuff to get people on the right track in life. And I really feel like these are all very have to be in the same toolbox to get people shifted, particularly in my community, from poverty to full-time employment and full-time access, and make a much better civil society where all of us feel included.
Okay, great. What about you, Deborah?
Well, for me, I was a litigator, so this was completely foreign to me. But I took 13 years off to take care of my children, came back into the law, and realized all that skill that I learned from being a PTA mother and getting people to do things they didn't really want to do gave me the ability to realize that litigation wasn't really the only way to get from point A to point B, that I'd learned this skill set of listening to people and helping them, reach an agreement that they both found was really palatable for both of them. It also helped that throughout my life I've owned dogs and I show dogs, and so I've watched in the dog show arena people losing friendships of many, many, many years over misunderstandings, and no one had a venue in which to have a conversation. So I would litigate, and I would often try to talk to these people, but quite frankly, I didn't know anything about mediation because I'm so old that mediation wasn't something they taught in my law school when I went there in the early 80s. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't something that came naturally to me until I came back into the law, and now it just is the perfect way to give people the opportunity to resolve a conflict they're having with someone else over an animal before they litigate. I love the beauty of the fact that they can always litigate if they mediate first. But if they mediate, they can often do it in less time, for less cost, and also retain the relationship at the end of the day.
All right, so let's normalize this for listeners, because I have talked to so many colleagues and ADR practitioners, and even just colleagues who are not in the ADR field about this series, and they raise their eyebrows and they look at me as if I'm from Mars, and they're like, what are you talking about? So let's normalize this. What kind of disputes involving animals that are amenable to conflict resolution practices? And you mentioned mediation, but there's other, collaborative practice, facilitated dialogue, but what are some examples that you can talk about? Maybe each of you can give a brief example or range of examples.
Well, Patty, it's funny you said that, because when I told my husband that I was going to focus on mediating conflicts between people about animals, he goes, that's such a narrow niche. And as Gary will tell you in his niche as well of working with people with animals, it is a blossoming field, because not only is it in trust in estates, deciding to resolve conflicts when someone is incapacitated or dies, and they have pets remaining behind, in divorce, in landlord-tenant, even in criminal matters. You can use mediation to resolve things between the people that involve the animal. It creates the ability to have the conversation that most people who sue never get to have. And as far as, say, take a neighbor with a barking dog, you really want to be able to wave to your neighbor after you have the discussion about the barking dog, and often that's not the case.
I agree with Deborah. This is indeed a blossoming area, and even more so than I first learned when I first came to this area of law practice as a past chair of the animal law section. This field has even gained more credibility thanks to my efforts, Deborah's efforts, and efforts of many others in the animal law field. In terms of specific examples, some of the most easiest, because I'm not crazy about that way of defining this area of law practice, because this is no more simple than is, say, family law. But more specifically, I've been applying ADR tools as well as soft mediation, even sort of a soft mediation through alternative health, to discuss how we make a much more accessible community for people with disabilities and older adults. And I've done that in a couple ways, both at the Civil Rights Commission in terms of traditional mediation. I've also done that in terms of public policy facilitation through various forums where I bring people with disabilities, able-bodied people, to discuss both the evolving law of disability law and practice, as well as where the gaps are between that kind of law that's on the books and the day-to-day practice of the law. And then also hopefully to arrive at a solution.
Right. So a lot of things that a lot of listeners and even practitioners might not even be aware of, especially around the policies around disabilities, assistive, and we're going to talk a lot about that in parts 1 and 2 of the next parts of the episodes around, what is an assistive, dog, a guide dog. There's all these language and definitions. We'll clarify those things. But you also hear, or at least I do, and I know, Debra, you've done this as well, is that, the whole pet custody, when someone is divorcing, or, for me, I have a beloved dog. She's Lucy. She's a Bichon. I've even put her in my will. What happens to my husband and I? What happens to our dog? We want to make sure she's taken care of. And you now hear about divorcing couples or even couples who aren't married and they're separated, and yet they want to come to an agreement about their beloved pet, So you're hearing and seeing more and more of these types of cases. So I'm glad you're saying this is a blossoming area. So I just wanted to make sure to normalize that. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. The Mid-Atlantic Journal on Law and Public Policy, as I recall, I'm the co-president of the journal. We'll have an article this issue on sort of child mediation, animals and mediation type issues. So that's definitely a very important issue. And then Maryland just recently, to allow people to set up situations so that they can address the needs of their companion animals or assistance dogs as they depart this corporeal plane.
And Debra, you were going to add something?
It's really important because the case that just was decided and everyone was so excited about here in New York, Travis v. Murray, where the judge actually found that the dog that was owned by the divorcing couple was more than just a chair and was more in the realm of the El Dorado or the Ferrari. So he granted a hearing. But for me, although it was groundbreaking, it was also heartbreaking because he told them that the hearing must find sole custody of the dog, and he would not entertain any sort of side agreements that had to do with visitation or co-ownership. So if you are currently owning a pet, Patty, you just said, I love my dog, I have it in my will. If you own a pet and you get divorced, feelings are not good at that time, and sometimes pets are held for ransom because somebody knows just how important they are. In fact, there was an article in the Miami Herald a few years ago where an attorney said, I couldn't believe my client left $20,000 on the table to keep the dog, and the dog was old. And I wrote back a comment to the Miami Herald and said, they didn't get it, because it's about creating an ability to have this discussion either hopefully before. I'm actually putting together a program right now that teaches divorce attorneys how to have this conversation with their clients up front, as Gary and I say early and often, about who's going to take the pet and how the pet is going to be distributed, because a lot of times people don't even think about that until the very end. And then I've had many attorneys come up to me and say my divorce agreement almost blew up because nobody wanted to decide who got the dog. So
I think an important nugget to tease out of what Debra just said to summarize it, I think if we're talking about health and safety issues or end-of-life planning issues with our animals, then what Debra, I think, is talking about is how do we have difficult conversations on very important topics. And both she and me believe that a full range of ADR tools can be used to do that.
Absolutely. Well, and we're going to talk about some of those tools. So, listeners who are tuned in, you are tuned in to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program, and I'm talking with Debra Hamilton with Hamilton Law and Mediation, and Gary Norman, attorney at law on the East Coast, about animal-related disputes. So, for our listeners who are conflict resolution practitioners, they're like, you piqued their interest. Would you say, well, you've already said that this is actually a blossoming niche area. So if they're wanting to get into this area, should they be seeking to mediate such disputes? Do they need specialized training or experience to do this kind of work?
Well, I actually gave a program at the ADR conference in Michigan or in Minnesota last summer, I think, fall or summer, it was October, on bringing pet conflicts into your practice. And I give them all over the country because you do really need to know what you're faced with, because it is similar to child custody. So if you're a good child custody mediator, great. However, the laws, as Gary will absolutely support me on, are so different that you really need to know what mediation brings to the table that gives the people more of what they want that they won't get if they go to court.
I think that's true. I would frame it as need. I don't know if that's too strong of a word, but it's definitely helpful, and it amplifies your ability to use your basic mediation skills training, but directed in a fashion that helps address the issues of people and their animals, and when those conflicts meet in a negative way.
And let's not forget people who don't like animals, and they need to be heard too.
And that's absolutely correct. I mean, certainly, if we're talking about fair housing in the next couple episodes, assistive dog issues, there are certainly people who will, on the surface, say, I don't want your guide dog here, but really what they're saying is perhaps they don't like dogs. They may have some sort of alleged allergy, maybe a legitimate allergy. So you have to create spaces where people can hear each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm glad that you said that, because, you know, we don't want, especially as practitioners in this field, that we don't want to see as if we're being taking sides to the pet owner, but we have to give, as you said, that space and that place for them to be heard if they legitimately, or not just legitimately, that they don't like dogs or cats or any kind of animal, that we have to give that space for them to be heard and understood as well, and that's really important. So you've talked about a number of tools, from these difficult conversations to mediation to, you know, collaborative practice. Talk a little bit more about these other tools in the ADR toolbox that may be used to resolve animal conflicts.
I think there's two tools, and Debra and I just talked about these on the Pet Summit, so I direct all of your attention to that, to look at that offline sometime. Number one is your traditional ADR tool of facilitation. I've been designing this past year through the Lyceum many different kinds of programs where I facilitate or co-facilitate on various topics involving animals, disabilities, and civil rights. And then also, as I envision it, I believe there's a real space to bring the law and alternative health together, which I consider a kind of soft mediation or soft ADR, and that is resolving disputes in a preemptive manner by allowing people to do group exercise together, do group yoga, do mindfulness practice, so that they are more reflective, less reactive, more prone to understand the viewpoints of others by controlling their anger and anxiety instead of having that control them in very stressful, bad situations.
Absolutely.
And Deborah?
It simply put, you as a mediator in these kind of situations, you need to really remember your neutrality, because you need to provide the people who are coming to you with the conflict the ability to feel heard, respected, and understood. And that's something that they won't get in a courtroom necessarily, because the emotions that are they're usually behind the conflict, don't come in.
I'm so glad that you brought that piece in, that reflective practice, that mindfulness, because some of us probably, you know, have, whether you're a mediator, attorney, or whatever, have these assumptions about maybe they lack the value or understanding of why it's important. You know, I've heard people, practitioners, whether they're an attorney or mediator, who will say, pets? Really? Why is that even important? And they're just stumbling on themselves because they don't understand what it is they're hearing from the people that they're working with about why that's of value to them, and they want to dismiss that. And so I've heard that, and so this mindfulness piece of it that you're talking about is very important for them to be reflective and impartial to whichever way that they feel about animals. And by the way, when we speak about animals, we're not just talking about cats and dogs, right? We're talking about all kinds of animals, I would assume.
No, I just wrote an article for the New York State Divorce Mediation Council, and the title of it was Fluffy and Fido and Elsie, because we discussed divorce in farm situations as well. There are lineages of cows and pigs and chickens, and what do you do? Mediation is sometimes the best way to recognize that these cows are not just value on a hoof, but rather they might be your 4-H horse or your 4-H cow that you won the blue ribbon with, and this is the third descendant. And so you really, as a mediator, have the ability to allow for that piece to come in and be respected, so that when things are discussed in divorce or in any sort of other venue that you might be having an animal conflict, you really can get a feel for why this animal is so important to this person, be it a pet in a home or a cow standing out in the field.
Okay, excellent. So glad that you clarified that. So, again, a very blossoming area that really covers a lot of venues, whether it's family business like farming, to the policies around assistive dogs, or I know I'm using the wrong terminology, and that's what we're going to all learn about in the next 2 episodes, and Gary will definitely take the lead on that. But those areas around disabilities, especially in the public venues, you go to the restaurant, you go to a movie, you get on the airplane, and some of the conflict that occurs there. Now, the last question that we'll use for this episode is, where and how do conflict resolution practitioners implement animal-related conflicts in their practices? First of all, there's not like a ton of training going on around animals, so really they're looking to the two of you for some of these specialized. But where and how can they begin to implement animal-related conflicts into their practices?
They can get training by Debra and me first of all.
Good. You, Gary, that's absolutely right. And really, they need to figure out what it is that brings them to that. It's a passion. I mean, Gary and I both, when we start to talk, as you can see here, it's a passion. If you don't have a passion, it's not an easy practice to add to your mediation quiver. However, most people that I've come up against either have, I would never handle an animal case, the people are crazy, that's their idea, or, oh my God, I would love to help people who are having this because my animals mean so much to me, that's another place. So you really need to first, and I think Gary will agree with me, you have to examine where you're coming from first, whether or not you are able to leave your personal opinion about pets at the door.
I agree with everything that Debra said.
Okay. Now, Gary, you mentioned, and I believe Debra did too, the Animal Summit. Can you just briefly describe what that was? Because you said people could go there and see some information. What's that?
The Ultimate Pet Resolution Summit. It's the second one that I'm running, so I will jump in there. Sorry, Gary, and I interviewed Gary for it. I've interviewed veterinarians. I've interviewed human-animal bond people, pet people trainers, attorneys, mediators, to discuss how in their practice they have either used or could see the benefit of using ADR when conflicts arise involving pets. And it's going to come out probably mid-February. I've been having a little bit of a website changeover issue, so it hasn't been published yet, but I will let you know, and it'll be published soon. And there is 12 luminaries in the field who are going to speak again. There was one last year at this time, and they're going to speak again about how to really bring ADR into the animal field, because it's across the board. It even includes veterinary medicine. I actually spoke at the AVMLA last year to the defense for the insurance companies, and am really trying to get them to assist veterinarians in having this conversation before the trigger is pulled on their malpractice, so they can't talk to their clients, because that's in the benefit of the insurance company, but certainly not in the benefit of the veterinarian who loses the client because they can no longer talk.
I do acknowledge Debra and give her a lot of... I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Gary.
I do acknowledge Debra and give her a lot of support and honor for all the hard work she's done to create the summit. It's an innovative tool to bring people together to talk about various pet issues with a focus, of course, on ADR, and I've been very happy to speak as part of that series.
Well, okay, great. So this is not a live series. This will be something that people will be able to listen to on their own schedule. Is that right?
Absolutely. It will air at a certain time. It's going to be 1 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then you can go back and re-listen or listen for the first time if that doesn't work in your time schedule for about 24 hours afterwards.
Okay, so what I'll do is once I get that information from you, Deborah, I'll put it on your show page so that way people who are, listening to this podcast, archived show here, they'll be able to see that so people will remember and know how to link into that for mid-February. I'm so glad, Gary, that you were part of that, and I remember seeing and hearing some of those episodes last year, and they were great, so I'm glad that you've continued with that. So we are about to close the program for the night, and I appreciate our listeners who are in the studio, in our chat room. I appreciate my student intern who's been twittering away here. We have some folks who have been joining in that, so thank you, everyone, for participating. We usually do an assignment for the week or a call to action, so do either of you have a thought about the next step that listeners can take if they're interested, either from a practitioner standpoint or from someone who has a pet conflict?
Well, Gary, you go first.
Well, first and foremost, as we said, I don't think Debra and I will be doing autographs, but certainly everybody can send some dog bones, my guide dog. But more seriously, find out what you're passionate about, reflect on it, do a mantra if you can, and then use your training as mediators or as lawyer mediators like Debra and myself to really make positive change. And I believe you can do that through public policy facilitation by bringing the able-bodied and the disabled together to talk about public access issues.
Okay,
and for
great.
me, my takeaway for everyone, if they are on the phone and thinking about doing animal conflict resolution using ADR, to really recognize where they are in the scheme of things. As Gary said, reflect on where that's the hardest piece of when I mediate is for me not to really let my own emotions run away with them. And I for homework, I would say if you go to a dog park or you go to a real estate broker or you go to a dog training site, go and talk to the people about how they handle the conflicts. It's interesting that they don't even know that we exist, and I guess that was why I did the program that I did in Minnesota at the annual meeting of conflict resolvers, because we have to get on board because people don't know that we are even available to help them resolve these conflicts, and they're suffering in silence, and I just want to relieve that. That's my mission.
I think that's true. The issue of visibility is so very important. That's what I've been talking about lately, is trying to expand our access rights for people with disabilities and older adults by having more people like myself in the boardroom, on Main Street, in Wall Street, instead of our historical exclusion from society. And I think people like Debra and myself need to continue to advance those conversations through alternative conflict approaches, facilitation, mediation, collaborative law practice, the full range of tools as we've talked about this evening.
Okay, great. So this is not the end of the series, listeners. We are going to pick up on the 21st and 28th of this month for a two-part episode, if you will. It's called Fido and Kitty, When Public and Private Venues Square Off. And just briefly, what this two-part episode is about is really discussing a really hotbed arena where a myriad of conflicts continually arise involving the access of service animals in our society. So again, Fido and Kitty, When Public and Private Venues Square Off, will have both Debra and Gary returning. That's January 21st and 28th. So definitely come back and continue listening to the series. Now, again, you can reach Debra Hamilton at hamiltonlawandmediation.com. You'll also find her Ultimate Pet Resolution Summit there posted in mid-February, so be tuned into that. And, of course, we'll be Twittering and Facebooking and doing all of those things for that summit. And then, of course, you can reach Gary at www.gnormanlaw.com. Any final messages, Gary or Debra, that you want to leave?
Just that I'm very honored to be part of this particular recording. I believe it's a real way for all of us to come together, bring our heads together, and talk about how we apply ADR in animal conflicts.
And I echo that, Patty, because it is getting out there and being brave enough to talk about what some people may consider a very silly venue because it's only a dog or it's only a cat, but quite frankly, it's so much more.
Well, thank you so much for being courageous with me to do this series and to be the frontiersman, if you will, and blazing the trail in this area. And I think this is really exciting. I'm very excited about this area. And I really hope that through education and awareness, both for the practitioner, but also the person who has the pet conflict is aware that there's resources and help for them. So we'll continue this conversation back on January 21st. That is a Tuesday night, same time, 7 p.m. Central. And again, thank y'all for being with us, and thank you, listeners, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Patty. Have a good week.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.